Hi, everyone. In this session, we want to talk a little bit about the concepts of deterrence. As you may know, deterrence as a formal piece of study really begins with the Cold War and the idea that we want to try and make sure that we can deter the use of nuclear weapons. The real truth of this is that traditional deterrence goes back a lot further than that, but it comes into its mainstream academic and professional well-being based in the Cold War. And I expect that almost any of you can look at the main characters here and see who they are. But the idea is, in the traditional form of deterrence, that people and states don't want to die and that they will behave rationally to avoid the use of weapons of mass destruction. And we do this, we come up with the idea by basically saying, look, there are certain benefits and costs to any given course of action. And there are also consequences for not taking that action. And when we look at that, we understand that, gee, nuclear deterrence is not the only thing that can be used. And in fact, that one-size deterrence really won't work. Actually, one-size deterrence never worked. If you go back in history, people looked at all kinds of ways to try and deter opponents from attacking them, but it only comes into sort of a formal academic and professional study of the Cold War. So there are a couple of different issues that I think you need to be familiar with when you look at deterrence. The first is the juxtaposition of deterrence and compellence. Deterrence, not surprisingly, is trying to get somebody to not do something, and compellence is trying to use force to make them do something, even if they don't want to. And it might seem like an academic distinction, but in fact, it can matter if you are, as the slide suggests, looking at the problems of China militarizing islands in the South China Sea. Clearly, deterrence didn't work, and now we are faced with an environment in which a sort of very feeble-looking deterrence can be continued to apply, or we can try and compel China to do it, or we can simply accept the status quo. Any of those is feasible, but the distinction between deterrence and compellence is important. And it's important to understand that when we look at deterrence, what we really are looking at ways to try and make it obvious to our opponents that their ideas of trying to do things we don't like are really bad. And what we want to do is to encourage our adversaries to show restraint and to not do things. There are a whole lot of means that are listed here, but the core concept of deterrence is the idea that we want to encourage adversary restraint. So we also go on with this. The old castles were a way to try and make defeat really, really costly and very, very difficult. More recently, we have promised that if people don't do what we want them to do, we can punish them. And we can punish them in a way that will be unacceptable. Another major dichotomy within the overall field of deterrence is who are you going to protect? It's pretty obvious that you will work to protect the homeland, and there's no credibility about that. I think that anyone who believes an attack on the United States will not be answered really only has to look to 9/11 in the most recent instance, when not only did the United States respond, but it got all of its NATO allies to respond as well. Extended deterrence is a much more complicated problem because what it says is that we're going to protect our allies. And there's always a credibility problem of, will you use your military force, your people, your money, your treasure, whatever it is, to protect your allies when push comes to shove? And the United States has longstanding issues about how it is to demonstrate credibility with our allies, how credible is, in fact, the commitment to its allies, and should we do more or should we do less? And those are debates that you see in the newspapers today, pretty much being fought over by different factions within the government. Credibility has three major components. The first two are usually pretty well understood. If I apply the credibility questions to the United States, it's pretty clear that we have the capacity to carry out threats. It's pretty clear that we can impose pretty substantial costs. The question is whether or not we will go forward with that. The United States, after all, is the only country that has ever used nuclear weapons in an armed conflict. So there is an assumption that the United States will carry out threats if deterrence fails. That actually provides some incentive for people to go along with what we want. But it's not abundantly clear in all instances whether we will use that ultimate force. Because the ultimate force threat is so huge, the idea of tailored deterrence is developed really by game theorists over the course of the 60s and 70s and expanded into the 80s and 90s. And we look at different audiences when we look at tailored deterrence. For near-peer competitors, we pretty much have the standard stuff, but with rogue states and terrorist networks, we look at really different kinds of folks. And this slide really shows the different levels of interaction for a peer competitor with rogue states and with violent extremists. And you can see that the engagement levels that are required are very, very difficult, and how we go about it is going to be, as a result, very, very different. The questions that we need to ask in this environment is whether or not the leaders of rogue states are rational. And if we don't know the answer to that, then the question is, how do you deter them? And in fact, can they be deterred at all? It's not clear that we can stop Kim Jong-un from developing nuclear weapons. He is pretty determined to do so. He seems to have gone pretty far along that way. And to be frank, nothing the United States has said or done has slowed that approach at all. We were not able to deter ISIS. It's not clear that we can deter the Soviet Union, Iran, or China in any interesting way at this point, other than with the ultimate threat, which is don't use nuclear weapons or we'll waste you. So when we look at terrorists and we look at the questions of deterrence, you got to ask whether it's at all feasible. And there are a couple of problems. And normally we look at deterrence as if you don't do what we want, we're going to punish you. And it's hard to punish somebody whose basic means of action is with suicide bombers, because that doesn't comport very well with our understanding of what a rational behavior would be by an opponent. And so what we do to deter terrorists tends to be more on the side of using defensive measures such as those we see in airports and other places, and a real change in our body politic and what we accept and what we don't accept as intrusions on our privacy that has occurred since 9/11. The final question in all of this is, does deterrence have any kind of future going forward? And I think that what we need to do is understand who our possible opponents are. Are they megalomaniac crazies? Are they calculating political leaders? Or are they something else? And we have to understand what it is that they might want as you go forward in your careers. These questions are not going to go away anytime soon. And we have to adapt to them so that we are, in fact, in a stronger rather than a weaker position.